I was not supposed to survive the Arctic. That is not fear speaking. That is math. We had calculated distances, rations, weather patterns, and ice drift with obsessive precision. Every variable accounted for, every risk reduced to probability. And yet, none of that mattered, because what we encountered out there did not behave like an animal. It did not behave like a force of nature, and it did not behave like something that wanted us gone. It behaved like something that was learning us. If you are listening to this right now, then you are already part of the pattern. People who find this story do not do so by accident. They find it because curiosity has teeth, and some things notice when you look too closely. Before I tell you what followed us across the ice, I want you to do 3 things. First, like this video. Not for the algorithm, but because it signals that you are still here, still listening. Second, subscribe. These stories disappear more often than you think, and some stories do not wait to be told twice. And third, leave a comment telling me where you are listening from. City, country, or wilderness. Location matters more than you realize. Now listen carefully. What we saw in the Arctic was not hunting us. It was studying how we moved, how we reacted, how long it took us to notice it was there. And I was the first one who understood that it had been watching us long before we ever stepped onto the ice. By the next morning, one of us was missing. There was no sign of struggle, no torn fabric, no disturbed snow. His place in the formation simply existed without him, like a word removed from a sentence that still tried to make sense. We did not call his name. That was not a decision. It happened naturally, as if some unspoken understanding had settled over us that sound was no longer safe when directed outward. I studied the perimeter of our last camp. The snow had shifted subtly, not trampled, not broken, but redistributed. Patterns where none should form. Curves too intentional to be wind-shaped. I realized then that it had stopped pacing us. It was now positioning us. The presence no longer felt external. It pressed inward, narrowing the space in which thoughts could move freely. I noticed how my own thinking had begun to simplify. Decisions felt binary. Move or stop, speak or remain silent. Complexity was being shaved away. We continued traveling, but I could no longer tell you why. Forward had lost meaning. Direction was now something imposed rather than chosen. At midday, the pressure increased sharply. It felt like standing beneath a descending ceiling. Not crushing, just lowering, forcing adaptation. One man began breathing too fast. Another began counting steps aloud before catching himself and stopping abruptly. I understood then that it was mapping our coping mechanisms. Fear, Adlet, ritual, anything repeatable. That afternoon, I did something reckless. I stepped out of formation. The pressure snapped toward me instantly, focused and intense. The air felt denser. My thoughts slowed, but I kept walking, angling away, forcing separation. For a moment, nothing happened. Then I felt it directly behind me, not touching, not threatening, present. I did not turn. I spoke instead. I told it we understood. I told it we would adjust. I told it we would become predictable if that was what it required. The pressure eased slightly. That was the most terrifying moment of the expedition, because it meant it could understand intent. That night, another man vanished. The group did not react. No shouting, no searching, just quiet recalibration. I realized then that the Adlet did not need to take us all. It only needed to reduce variability. The first thing that went wrong was not the cold. People always expect that. They imagine frostbite, whiteouts, screaming wind, and the slow arithmetic of starvation. But the Arctic did not turn on us all at once. It watched us arrive calmly, almost politely, as if waiting to see what we would do. We reached the ice shelf just after what passed for morning. The sky was pale and wrong, stretched thin like fabric pulled too tight. Sound behaved strangely there. Voices carried too far. Footsteps arrived late. Sometimes they did not seem to come from where you were standing at all. I noticed that before anyone else did. We set camp in a shallow basin, sheltered by ridges of old ice that looked like frozen waves. The men joked while unloading gear. Routine behavior. Human noise meant to push back the emptiness. I let them talk. I focused on the surface beneath my boots. There were no tracks. That should have reassured me. Untouched ice suggested isolation, but something about the smoothness bothered me. It was not natural smoothness. It was consistent, like something had passed through repeatedly and learned how not to leave a mark. I said nothing. The first night passed without incident, but none of us slept properly. The silence pressed inward. Even breathing felt intrusive. I lay awake listening to the faint creaks of shifting ice and counting the seconds between them. The intervals were wrong, too regular, almost deliberate. On the second day, I realized we were being paced, not followed, not stalked, paced. No matter how we adjusted our route, the distance between us and something unseen remained constant. When we slowed, the pressure eased. When we pushed forward, it returned. There was no sound behind us, no shape on the horizon, just the persistent sensation of alignment, like two objects moving in parallel. One of the men asked if anyone else felt watched. The question died in the air immediately, as if embarrassed to exist. Another laughed too quickly and suggested cabin fever. I did not correct him. By the third day, the ice began to feel occupied. That is the only word that fits. Not dangerous, not hostile, occupied. I started noticing disruptions in our routines. Tools placed where no one remembered leaving them. Frost brushed away from surfaces that should have remained untouched. Our breath hanging longer in the air when we spoke certain words. Names, directions, measurements. At dusk, I saw it for the first time. Not clearly, not fully. A shape at the edge of vision, upright but not human, maintaining distance with mathematical precision. When I turned my head, it vanished. When I looked away, the pressure returned. That was when I understood something critical. Predators rush, weather overwhelms, but this presence was waiting, studying how long it took us to notice patterns, how fear altered our decisions, how isolation changed our posture. That night I stayed awake on purpose, and sometime between breath and heartbeat I realized the Arctic was no longer empty. It was listening. Morning did not arrive. The light returned, but it did not feel like morning. There was no sense of reset, no emotional boundary between night and day. It was as if time itself had flattened, stretched thin across the ice. Two of the men claimed they had slept. I did not believe them. Their movements were too careful, too rehearsed. Sleep leaves disorder behind. They were performing rest, not recovering from it. We broke camp in silence. I noticed then that our formation had changed without discussion. We walked closer together. Not shoulder to shoulder, but nearer than efficiency required. Fear had rewritten our geometry. The presence adjusted accordingly. The pressure no longer stayed behind us. It began to circle, not physically, perceptually, like something testing how our attention fractured when pulled in multiple directions. At one point, I stopped walking. The others took several steps before realizing. They turned, irritated, afraid, trying not to show either. I raised my hand and waited. The pressure stopped too. That was confirmation. Whatever was observing us did not move independently. It synchronized. It mirrored. It learned when to pause by watching us pause. I asked the men to describe the shape they had glimpsed. I did not lead them. I did not suggest details. Their answers matched too closely. Tall, upright, longer limbs than human proportion allowed. A head carried forward, not lifted. Weight balanced as if gravity were optional. One man mentioned its eyes. I told him to stop. Eyes imply expression, emotion. I did not want them thinking it had any of those. By midday, the wind picked up sharply, then died just as suddenly. Snow lifted and fell without drifting. The environment felt curated, adjusted in response to us rather than independent of us. We crossed an area where the ice rang beneath our feet, hollow, resonant. Each step produced a low tone, different in pitch depending on who stepped. I heard mine echo twice. That should not have been possible. That night, the presence made a mistake, or perhaps it wanted us to believe it had. A shadow moved too quickly, a shift in snow too heavy to ignore. One of the men shouted and turned with his flare already lit. For a fraction of a second, it was fully visible. Not attacking, not recoiling, standing. Its posture was wrong. Balanced, deliberate, symmetrical, as if built to observe rather than pursue. Its head tilted slightly, not in curiosity, but in calibration. Then it stepped back, and the Arctic swallowed it without sound. That was the moment fear changed shape, because now we knew it could be seen, and it knew how much we could tolerate. After the sighting, something inside the group fractured. Not morale, not discipline, certainty. Every decision began to feel provisional, as if we were improvising in a space governed by rules we did not understand. We were no longer explorers. We were variables. I realized then that we were not lost. We were being kept within bounds. Whenever we adjusted our heading too sharply, the pressure intensified. When we slowed excessively, the environment resisted. Snow thickened, ice softened. Progress became effortful in ways that felt corrective, like a hand on your shoulder, guiding without permission. One man suggested turning back. Another suggested pushing forward harder. Both suggestions felt wrong for the same reason. There was no direction that led away from it. That afternoon, one of the men fell. Not slipped, not tripped, stopped. His legs simply refused to move. He stared ahead, breathing shallowly, eyes unfocused, as if listening to instructions no one else could hear. When we grabbed his arms and pulled, his body resisted with surprising strength. He kept whispering a phrase under his breath, not words. Measurements, distances, time intervals, repeated again and again, refining slightly with each cycle. When he finally collapsed, the pressure eased. That was the first time we understood the cost of resistance. That night, the presence came closer than ever before, not physically, spatially. The air around us felt partitioned, divided into zones of permission and denial. I sensed where I could move and where I should not, the way prey senses open ground. I did not need to see it to know it was there. I understood then what the Adlet was not. It was not a guardian. It was not a predator. It was not a spirit bound to land or myth. It was a function, a system designed to study intrusion, to observe adaptation, to determine when something foreign became predictable enough to be controlled. And we were failing the test. Because fear makes humans inconsistent. And inconsistency, I realized too late, was the one thing it could not allow. Sleep became impossible after that, not because of fear, but because of anticipation. Each moment of stillness felt like an invitation. I stayed awake, monitoring my thoughts, keeping them irregular, refusing patterns. It noticed. The pressure returned whenever my mind settled into rhythm, whenever breathing evened out, whenever thought followed thought too smoothly. I began to disrupt myself deliberately. Irregular movements. Sudden stops, silent counting that never reached completion. The presence responded by closing distance, not in space, in influence. By the next day, we were no longer discussing decisions. We moved when movement felt allowed. We stopped when resistance formed. Choice had been replaced by compliance without instruction. I recognized the efficiency of it. No commands, no force, just environmental feedback until behavior aligned. One man broke. He laughed suddenly, loudly, the sound tearing through the quiet like an injury. He shouted nonsense, waving his arms, trying to reclaim chaos. The pressure slammed down instantly. He froze mid-motion, his body locked, muscles rigid, breath shallow. His eyes tracked something we could not see, following precise arcs as if watching calculations unfold in the air. When he collapsed, he did not fall forward. He folded, neatly. That night, the presence revealed something new, a sound. Not vocal, not mechanical. A low, structured vibration that resonated through the ice beneath us. Each pulse carried information, not language, but sequence. I felt it rewriting my sense of time. Past and future blurred, cause and effect loosened. I understood then that the Adlet was not ancient in the way myths describe. It was persistent. It did not need memory because it encoded outcomes. We were not the first expedition. We were not even unusual. We were a data set. And datasets, once complete, do not require preservation of individual entries. By dawn, only 3 of us remained, and the Arctic had become very quiet again. By the time we understood what was happening, it was already too late to name it. Naming implies distance. It implies you can stand outside a thing and point at it. Out there was no outside. The presence had moved into the structure of our days, into the rhythm of our decisions, into the way our bodies chose to conserve energy without our permission. We stopped speaking entirely, not as a rule, but as evolution. Silence felt like camouflage. Speech felt like a flare. The 3 of us moved with the same spacing, the same pace, the same pauses, as if we were trying to convince the Arctic we had become a single organism. I watched the others from the corner of my eye. Their faces had changed, not with frostbite or hunger, with compliance. At midday, we reached an area of ice that looked different. It was smoother, darker, and strangely clean, like a surface that had been maintained. The wind did not deposit snow there. It slid across it without catching. One of the men stepped onto it and stopped immediately. He stared down, then slowly lifted his foot and placed it back where it had been, as if he had felt a boundary under the sole. I copied him. I felt it too, not a physical ridge, a threshold. The pressure increased the moment we approached the center of the dark ice, but it was not hostile. It was directive. like the resistance you feel when you try to push a door that opens the other way. We adjusted without discussion. We skirted the surface, staying at its edge. That was a mistake, because the moment we adapted, the pressure eased. The presence rewarded alignment. It wanted us to learn faster. It wanted fewer errors. The man behind me began to tremble. I looked back and saw his lips moving. Silent repetition, a private chant. I understood he was trying to stabilize himself with pattern. The presence noticed. He stiffened abruptly, not from cold, from interruption. His tremor stopped, his lips halted mid-word. His eyes widened as if he had been grabbed by something inside his skull. He turned his head slowly toward the open white horizon. Then he walked away. He did not stagger. He did not hesitate. He did not look back. He walked straight out across the ice, like a man obeying instructions he could not refuse. The second man moved to follow him, then stopped. His face tightened as if he were fighting a thought. He looked at me, and in that glance I saw it clearly. The fear was no longer about death. It was about losing authorship of your own body. I grabbed his arm. He resisted, then leaned in close enough that his breath touched my cheek. He whispered one sentence. "It is not watching us. It is correcting us." Then he pulled away and began walking too. I stayed where I was, alone, listening to the ice, and the ice listened back. The horizon became unfamiliar after that, not visually. It was the same endless line of white and gray, but the scale felt altered, as if distance had been compressed. I would walk for what felt like hours and realize I had made no real progress. I tested it. I planted a marker behind me, a small piece of dark fabric tied to a stake. I walked forward, counting my steps carefully, then turned. The marker was gone. No trail led to it, no disturbance. Nothing. It had been removed so cleanly that it felt like it had never existed. That was when I understood the Arctic was no longer functioning as geography. It was functioning as a controlled space, a laboratory, and I was the remaining subject. The pressure returned slowly, like a hand settling onto my spine. It guided me not toward a destination but toward a state, toward predictable motion, predictable breathing, predictable thought. I fought it by changing my pace, by turning abruptly, by stopping without reason. Each time the environment responded. Wind rose when I tried to sprint. Ice softened when I tried to stand still. Snow blew into my face when I tried to choose a new direction. There was no violence, just correction. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time had become unreliable. I began to feel my mind rounding off sharp edges. My thoughts grew simpler. My emotions flattened. That was the real mechanism, not the rote optimization. I began to understand why the others walked away without resistance. It was easier. And then in the middle of that emptiness, I saw it clearly for the second time. The Adlet stood on a rise ahead of me, fully visible. It was taller than a man, but not massive. Its proportions were wrong in a way that made my eyes slide off it. Long limbs held too still. Shoulders sat as if built to bear weight without fatigue. Its head angled slightly downward, not hiding, not threatening. Measuring, I realized I was not afraid of it. I was afraid of how calm it made me feel. It took one step forward. The air changed. My body tried to mirror its stillness. My breathing slowed without permission. My mind stopped reaching for explanations and began reaching for acceptance. I forced one thought through the narrowing space. If I become predictable, I disappear. The Adlet tilted its head a fraction more, as if receiving that thought like a signal. Then it lifted one hand, not to attack, to indicate, a direction. And the moment it did, my legs began to move. Not because I chose to, because I had been corrected. I do not remember deciding to follow. I remember the absence of resistance. My legs moved with steady efficiency, my breath settling into a rhythm that felt borrowed, each step aligned with the next perfectly. No hesitation, no wasted motion. The kind of movement you see in machines that have already solved their task. The Adlet remained ahead of me, never closer, never farther. Always at the correct distance. It did not look back. It did not need to. I realized then that pursuit had never been required, only orientation. The ice beneath us changed texture subtly, becoming smoother, denser, as if reinforced. The wind died completely. Silence returned, but it was no longer empty. It felt occupied, like a room where someone waits just out of sight. My thoughts began to thin, not vanish, simplify. Memories lost detail first. Faces blurred, names detached from meaning. Emotional weight drained away, leaving only function. Hunger. Fatigue, balance, forward motion. I fought it by recalling disorder, by dragging up moments of confusion, mistakes, unresolved questions. The pressure tightened whenever I succeeded. My skull ached, my vision narrowed. I understood the rule. Complexity was resistance. At one point I stopped walking. My body rebelled instantly. Muscles tightened, breath stalled, vision dimmed at the edges. It was not pain, it was correction, like a system pushing an error back into tolerance. The Adlet stopped too. It turned slightly, just enough that I could see the side of its head. There were no visible eyes in the way we define them. No whites, no pupils, just depth, curvature, a surface that reflected nothing back. I felt examined, not emotionally, structurally. It was not interested in who I was. It was interested in how deviation formed. I realized then that the others had not been taken. They had been resolved, reduced into outcomes that required no further observation. I was still here because I was inefficient, unstable, interesting. The Adlet lifted its hand again, indicating the same direction. This time I did not move immediately. The pressure surged, then paused. For the first time since the expedition began, the system hesitated. That hesitation was my only opening. I did not run. I turned sideways. I stepped into unpredictability. The ice cracked beneath my foot, sharp and loud, shattering the controlled silence. The pressure faltered, like a grip loosening in surprise. I fell, and in that fall, something inside me fractured that had been aligning for days. Fear returned, messy, low-aid. I screamed. The sound tore through the Arctic without permission. The Adlet recoiled, not in pain, in disruption. I ran without direction, not away from it, not toward safety, just wrong. I stumbled, I slipped, I gasped. My movements were erratic, wasteful, human. The environment responded late, sluggish, as if the feedback loop had been damaged. Snow blinded me. Wind returned in uneven bursts. The Arctic lost its precision. Behind me, the pressure surged and collapsed in waves, no longer smooth. The Adlet tried to reestablish alignment, but my behavior refused to settle. I laughed and cried at the same time. The sound was broken, unpatterned, perfect. I fell again hard, the impact knocking the air from my lungs. I lay there shaking, refusing to control my breathing, letting it hitch and stutter. The pressure receded, not fully, but enough. I understood then the final truth. The Adlet could not tolerate chaos. It could study fear. It could study obedience. It could study silence. But disorder broke the model. I stayed on the ground until the cold burned my skin and my muscles screamed. I forced myself to think badly, to remember things out of sequence, to mix images, emotions, nonsense. Eventually I stood. The Arctic felt empty again, not safe, but empty. I walked until my legs failed, then crawled, then slept without permission. When I woke, the sky had changed. The horizon felt distant again. Scale returned. I never saw the Adlet after that. But sometimes when I catch myself settling into routine too smoothly, when my days become too efficient, too predictable, I feel a familiar pressure at my back. A reminder that some systems do not hunt, they correct. And that survival is not about strength or intelligence. It is about remaining unfinished. I believed I had escaped. That belief lasted until I returned to places with walls. Civilization felt wrong immediately, not hostile, just inefficient. People moved without awareness of alignment. Sounds overlapped. Lights flickered. Schedules conflicted. It was chaos disguised as order, and part of me reacted. I began correcting myself. I walked straighter, spoke less, optimized my routines without meaning to. Meals at the same time, steps counted unconsciously, sleep reduced to functional intervals. It took weeks before I understood what was happening. The Adlet had not followed me. It did not need to. It had completed its study. Out there on the ice, it learned how humans break, how we simplify under pressure, how easily we surrender authorship when resistance becomes uncomfortable. And most importantly, it learned how little presence is required once correction has begun. I started noticing moments where my thoughts felt guided, not forced, suggested, when choices narrowed without reason, when hesitation felt wrong, not fear, efficiency. That was when I realized the Arctic was not unique. It was merely an optimal environment. The Adlet does not belong to a place. It belongs to a condition. Wherever humans attempt to become perfectly ordered, perfectly predictable, perfectly optimized, it is already there, not watching, waiting. I am telling you this now because speaking disrupts the pattern. Because memory, when shared, introduces noise. because stories refuse containment, and because if you are still listening, something in you has already resisted just enough to stay interesting. I survived by becoming unfinished, and I intend to stay that way. If this story unsettled you, do not brush that off. That feeling is not fear, it is recognition. Like this video to mark that you stayed present until the end. Subscribe, because stories like this do not surface often, and when they do, they tend to vanish without warning. And leave a comment telling me where you are listening from, city, country, or somewhere isolated. Patterns always begin with location, because the Adlet does not hunt places. It studies behavior, and it pays attention to who listens all the way through. I will be back with another account soon. Until then, stay irregular.